Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some unique poppy cards using Yanas Poppies Collection. This is a new collection from Spellbinders. I absolutely love that poppy die and this poppy background plate, and the fact that this poppy background plate has a coordinating layering stencil. It makes it so much easier to color, and you can even use different pasted mediums with the stencils, which gives you a little bit of opportunity for some extra texture and dimension. So I'm going to start creating a couple cards with the poppy background plate, and I'm using my Better Press system for this. So I just put the plate on the base, and I'm going to use Better Press cardstock for all the better pressing that I'm doing in this video. I tape it in place, and the piece that I have here is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. That background is going to go to all of the edges, but I know that when I go and put this on my card, I'm going to cut about 1/16 of an inch off each side. So where I've placed that tape and where it's going to miss the pattern, I'm going to be able to trim that off. The first impression I did with no ink at all. This is just going to give you that impression and that design, but no color. I'm going to use this for a card later on, but I wanted to do that one before I had put any ink onto my Better Press plate, just to ensure that there wasn't any ink residue left over, even if I've cleaned the plate off. For my first card, I'm going to use some Bundled Sage Distress ink on my press plates. Now, these press plates are so versatile. You could do many different techniques with them. I have a whole playlist where I'm doing different techniques with the Better Press system, and you can use many different inks. I haven't found an ink that hasn't worked yet. So just one impression with that Bundled Sage ink, and we get a beautiful background for this card. I'm going to set that aside. I'll be using it again in a little bit, but I want to do some coloring on this background. I'm going to use the coordinating stencil, and in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a number for each stencil, so you know what number order you can go in. You don't necessarily need to go in the number order because you're going to get the same result no matter what. I tend to go in number order, and the one thing that I love is the last one is typically the centers of the flowers, and I will often use some sort of a medium or something for the center of the flowers for a little bit of extra texture and dimension. For my flowers, I'm using saltwater taffy distress ink as well as worn lipstick. So I'm starting out with the saltwater taffy here. I'm heavier in the center of the flower, and then just use the ink that's still left on the brush to do the rest of those petals. So I'll start in the center, or the petal, or part of the petal that would be the center of the flower for each one, and then work my way out. And you'll see that I do re-ink my brush quite often just to get some dark ink for the centers of those flowers. This stencil is so easy to line up, and by using an Altenew sticky mat, it makes it really easy to hold that stencil down in place. I don't need to stick anything or tape anything down. That sticky mat does it perfectly, and it holds it really well. Now, I do find from things that I've stenciled in the past, it holds it well if you've got a good area on at least 2 sides of your image. If you don't have a good area on 2 sides, it may not hold it quite as well, but because this paper or the cardstock is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 and my stencil is a little bit bigger, I'm finding that it's holding it absolutely perfectly. For the second layer of the petals here, I'm using that same saltwater taffy, but then I'm going to go in with the worn lipstick and just do a little bit of deeper ink blending in the center of the flowers. I want each layer of petals to have just a tiny little difference in my inking. There's also some poppy pods, if you will, that I am adding, or that I'm using on this layer of stencil with some peeled paint distressing. And I'm going to do a detailed ink blending brush with these because of the fact that these areas are so small. If I use a larger brush, I'm likely going to get some of that green on some of the petals. So now that that one is done, I can just lay these pieces these stencils to the side. Because I'm just using distress ink, these stencils will just wash off with water. All I have to do is rinse them under a tap, and that ink comes right off. For the third layer, I'm using that worn lipstick pad once again, being heavy on the center of the flower or the base of the petal, and then going lighter on the outside of the petal, just to get a little bit of visual shading on the inside of that petal. You could use multiple colors for this. I'm using like coral colors because I love pink or coral looking poppies, but they come in so many different colors that you can have so much fun with this. There's also a couple buds there that I colored with the peeled paint distress ink as well. Once again, with that detailed ink blending brush, makes it really, really easy for getting that detail in there and making sure that you have the shading where you want it to go. I just have that brush out, so I'm going to use that to do the next layer, which is all of the different leaves. Just like the petals, I'm being heavier handed with the ink where it is at the base of the leaf or where the leaf goes behind a petal. And then I'm using just whatever ink is left on my brush to do the rest of the leaf. So I get some natural ink blending there. Once I have that one done, the next layer is the stems of the leaves. And just like my leaves, I'm going to be just doing it with the peeled paint. I'm being fairly heavy with this because these are just stems. They're really tiny. I want them to stand out from my green background. So I am going to be heavier with this ink than having some lighter areas and darker areas. Like I said, I want to make sure that you can see it from the peeled paint or the bundled sage background. For the centers of the flowers, I'm going to use some Hickory Smoke. It's just a nice dark gray. There's a couple little centers and buds there that I wanted to do in that peeled paint before time, but I want to make sure the centers of those flowers are nice and dark, but I don't want them so dark that you don't see any of the ink detail. It doesn't really matter though in the end, because I end up, once I cleaned my stencil off, I end up going back and putting some Stickles glitter gel in the centers. It's just going to give them a little bit of sparkle. You could also use Stickles and just dot it in the centers, but by using the stencil, it goes on super quick, super easy, and you get some beautiful sparkle there. I use a palette knife just to make sure I have a nice even coat here. Because I've already cleaned my stencil off, I don't need to worry about ink contamination, and I can tuck that whole thing aside to dry. I usually leave it for about an hour and it's good and dry by that time. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to do the sentiment for this card, and I'm using the Let's Celebrate Sentiments press plate set. This is from Yana's last collection, the Peonies one, and I love the blend of fonts on it. So I'm using the worn lipstick distress pad that I used on my background, making sure to clean up any of the excess ink that's gotten on that background. I don't want it to transfer to the cardstock, and then put the clear plate to the base and put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And we have a beautiful sentiment. This collection, the Let's Celebrate Sentiments, has some dies for the larger sentiments. So I'm going to die cut that right away while I have my Platinum 6 machine on my desk. I like to tape that die in place just to make sure it's not going to shift on me while running it through my die cutting machine. I just use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape for that, and I reuse those tape bits until they don't stick anymore. They've got a lot of use in them, so we might as well make use of that. And there we have a beautiful sentiment to set aside. I figured while I was still waiting for those Stickles glitter gels to dry, I might as well start working on my second background. So this one, I'm going to use that same background plate. I'm going to ink it with Black Soot Distress ink, and I'm just getting it all over that background there. I want to be generous with that ink. If you don't get quite a complete press the first time, you can ink it a second time and run it through a second time. It's always nice if you can get it done in the one time, and I got it done the first time with just that one coat of ink. I'm using the Cloud9 Interference inks. If you've seen any of my other videos with them, you know I absolutely love them. They're like magic in a pad, and I thought they would be really fun to use for this peony background. I am using Peacock Tails for the poppies and Summer Garden for the greenery and the leaves. One thing I like to do when I'm using these interference pads is I like to play with using black ink underneath it. If you've never used these pads before, they are an interference pad that has a dye and a pigment. So the dye part is what colors the light cardstock, and the pigment is, or mica, is what colors the dark cardstock. So on the right side of the pad, you see the color that you're going to see on the light color, or sorry, the left side of the pad, you're going to see the color that you see on the light cardstock. And on the right side of the pad, you're going to see the color that you see over black or dark cardstock. So once I have my black ink where I want it to go, and I put it for these particular ones on the centers of the flowers or the base of the petals, And then I use a soft cloth and wipe off that black ink from my stencil. I don't want it to transfer or go into my interference pad. And then I use a brush from my interference pad to ink that area. And I'll repeat that with all of the different layers. I want to make sure to clean off the excess black ink to keep my interference pad uncontaminated. And the other thing I like to do is I have a brush for each one of my interference pads. I just use a label from my label maker so I know exactly which brush goes with which one. That way I can make sure that those aren't contaminated as well, because each of the pads have a different dye color and a different pigment color. I didn't want to mess with it, and I just use a brush with each one of them. And for some of them I have a detailed ink blending brush as well as a larger ink blending brush for each one. It just depends on the area that I'm going to color. So I'm doing the same thing with this layer that I did with the first layer. I put on my black distress ink, and it can be any black ink that you want. I like to do distress ink because it's a dye-based ink. It cleans off my stencil super easy, and it works. It's effective. You could use another type of dye-based ink if you want, but again, I like it because it comes off my stencil really easily. For the summer garden pad here, I'm using that for the poppy pods or the leaves. It has green where the white pieces are, and then it has a blue interference color where it's going over black. So I love the play on the two colors there as well. And that coordinates beautifully with the blue from the peacock tails. So I'm doing exactly the same method here, going in with my black ink with a blending brush, and then I'm going to use my soft cloth and wipe that off and then put my interference color here. Now I could just skip this black ink altogether and just put the interference pad, and what I would end up with is blue poppies that would have like a purple shimmer when you tilt it in the light. So even on the light part of the image, you still get that purple shimmer when you tilt it in the light, but I just love the look of it when you see the magic that happens when you have it on both colors. So I'm quite liberal with the ink. I like to put a lot of ink on there, make sure that it's nice and fully covered. With the other background, I made sure that it was lighter in the center, darker on the outside. But because for these ones, I'm using the black to put underneath for the darker area or the base of the leaves or the petals, I can be just even-handed with my interference inks when I'm coloring in those areas. For the leaves and the greenery, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm putting the black ink where it would be darker or where a leaf is going behind a petal. I did go back in with my detailed ink blending brush and bring up some of that black layer to in the center of the leaf, going up it a little bit. Not too much, because I still want to be able to see those green properties as well. And then it cleaned off my stencil, and then I'm going back in with that summer garden ink. For the summer garden ink, I happen to just have a detailed ink blending brush. This one's just a little bit larger. It still works just fine for these areas, even though these areas are a little bit bigger. It just takes a few seconds more to fill in the areas, but you can see that it doesn't take really that much more. And just like my peacock tails, I'm even-handed with the interference inks for this layer. Now, even though these interference pads are a blended ink, they wash off the stencils absolutely beautifully. Once again, only need to use a little bit of water to get them off. There's no cleaner needed, so there's no need to worry about them staining or ruining your stencils or being hard to get off your stencils. They come off absolutely beautifully. For my last layer here, I'm just going to use that same Hickory Smoke Distress ink that I used for my first card. I'm just going to fill in those areas, and then I'm also going to put that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel in the centers of those flowers. I just like the sparkle that it gives. You could also use like a clear or a glossy texture paste and then put some glitter on top of that if you wanted that look. This is just super easy, and it goes on in one application, so I don't need to worry about adding anything on there afterwards. Once again, I'm going to let this dry completely for probably about an hour. These areas aren't super big, but I want to make sure that they're completely dried before I continue on and make the rest of my cards. Off screen, I also did a sentiment for the second background from that same Let's Celebrate sentiment set. I just did it in colors that worked with that background. I think I used the Peacock Tails one. I can't remember now. I will remember when I see it. For these backgrounds, I'm cutting like a 1/16 of an inch off of each side just to make sure to get off that corner that didn't get the ink from my background. And I found a 1/16 of an inch off of each side was enough. You could do an 1/8 of an inch off of each side and make your background a little bit smaller and see a little bit more of the card base. I just absolutely love these backgrounds and didn't want to cut any more than absolutely necessary. So you can see a little bit of the white card base behind this, but you still mostly get that beautiful background. And this one would be a great one to do on a colored card base as well. I just chose white ones simply because the focus is on that background anyways. So I didn't think the card base really made a huge difference here. But I absolutely love the look of that background. And because it fills it in so beautifully, you really don't need a whole lot more than just a sentiment on the front. For gluing everything together, I'm using the same Barely Art glue that I use in most of my videos. I have it in a fine line bottle, so I can get as little or as much as I want. I noticed when gluing down this background that there was a tiny part of this corner that didn't have any ink on it. So I just took my detailed ink blending brush and just inked that corner up a little bit just to fill that in. It's likely something that no one else would have noticed, but because I noticed it while I was creating, it was an easy fix. I absolutely love the iridescent shimmer you get from that second background. I'm totally obsessed with it. When it comes to florals, I love the non-common colors. So when it comes to like poppies, I do love the dark red ones, but I love mostly the other colors. So I love the pinks and I love the plums and stuff like that. So you'll notice that when I do a lot of these florals, I'm sticking to non-traditional colors. For my third card here, I'm using the Yanas Poppy die that's part of this collection. And I'm just cutting some Hammermill cardstock. I'm going to cut this 4 times. And it will make sense a little bit more in a little bit. But what I'm doing is making sure that it all cuts through. I'm leaving that die cut in my die, and then I'm using some press and seal on the back of it. And then I'm going to take this out of the die. Now, like I said, I'm doing this 4 times. For 2 of them, I need the complete die cut because I need the outline, the greenery, and the outside stuff. For 2 of them, I only need the floral bits and the bits inside the poppy pod as well as the bud. Before I do anything else with the die cut, I'm using some black distress ink and I'm ink blending where I want the shadow to go. So I'm going to use these Cloud9 interference inks again. And I want to make sure, once again, that I see the areas that have the dark underneath as well as the areas with the light. So 2 of these are going to be my greenery parts, the outline of the poppy as well as the leaves. And then 2 of these are going to be the petal parts. So for the greenery parts, I'm doing my ink blending pretty much exactly the same as my background. I'm putting the black ink where I want the darkest color, where I want my shadow. So anywhere a petal goes behind another petal, for that outline, I'm putting that black ink there. I did black ink in the center of the poppy, and I just took those centers out because I don't want them to get inked with my next step. For the other 2 poppies, I'm putting the black ink where I want the shadow at the base of the petal. So we're going to do a little bit of paper piercing with this. For some people, this might be a little bit too much. I absolutely love the look of this, and I just love the final result. So I love doing this. When it's something that you love doing or you love seeing the result of it, you don't necessarily mind putting in a little bit of extra steps or whatnot. So I'm going to do the same shading with both of my flowers. My shading is going at the base of the petal. Doesn't matter if any of that ink goes on the outline because we're not using that on these particular pieces. We're only using the inside petal parts. So by having the outline on the different petals, it just gives you a little bit of a buffer zone. And I'm using a detailed ink blending brush so I can only get that ink exactly where I want it to go. Rather than using the same peacock tails as last time, I'm using Sweet Treat. So this one is going to show up yellow where the white cardstock is, and it's going to have a pinky corally color where my black ink is. Now, to be brutally honest, I don't like the result of this poppy. The only reason is because yellow is my least favorite color. I try to use it at times just to get myself out of my comfort zone, just to have a little bit of variation, but I just can't get over the yellow. I know there are people out there that is their favorite color and absolutely love yellow, so this might be your cup of tea. I think I would love it with a different color. I absolutely love the final design of the card. I just can't get over the yellow. So if I have any more negative comments about it, it's because of the color, not because of the technique or anything else. So once those flowers are inked, you can set it aside to dry. And for that one, you can kind of see the look of it on the black, how it has that corally pinky tone to it. And I absolutely love that corally pinky tone. For the two where I'm using it for the greenery, we're really only ink blending the leaves. We're ink blending the outlines to the different petals. So we don't need that ink in the center of those petals. We can just completely skip those areas. So it's not that I haven't, I've deliberately not inked the inside of the flowers because I just don't need to. Making sure that all the greenery is done as well as the outlines, and then just set it aside to dry. Once it has dried for a few moments, I'm going to take those outline pieces off of my press and seal backing. I want to make sure that when I put it onto my vellum backing, I don't accidentally get my fingers into the wet ink that's on the press and seal, because it wouldn't dry on the press and seal, and get some ink where I wouldn't want it to go. So I want to make sure that those pieces are off of there before I start to put it onto my vellum backing. And having said that, I don't think I mentioned that this die has two different pieces to it. There's a shadow outline part as well as the floral part in the center. The shadow outline part, I die cut it in vellum. I did 2 of the vellum pieces because we're going to do 2 of these florals for the front of the cards. I'm using that same Barely Art glue to glue it together, making sure to get it on any areas that stick out or poke out. It doesn't necessarily have to be on every single piece, but I do want it on most of the pieces so that I get a nice adherence to my vellum. Once I've put it down on the vellum, there's a little bit of a halo, so I want to make sure that halo is kind of even all the way around. And then I'm going to put a large acrylic block on that to hold it down nice and flat and make sure that that is held flat while it dries. Vellum doesn't like moisture, so it would tend to buckle and bend if I just left it alone. So by having that acrylic block on there, I can make sure everything stays flat. Once that has dried for a few minutes, I can start paper piecing in the petals. So I'm just going to add glue to a few of those areas, and then I'm just going to pop the petal pieces in like a puzzle piece. Now, by leaving those pieces or those die cuts on that press and seal, I know exactly which piece goes where. It makes it super easy to transfer it from one to the other. And by having just a tiny little bit of liquid glue on there, it's going to hold that in place. Hardest part is to make sure that it's placed in there properly. It's easy enough to pick it up. Now, one thing I didn't pay attention when I was die cutting, and some of these areas towards the center of the flower aren't completely die cut through. So you'll see me just kind of ripping the paper just a tiny little bit. I'm not ripping the petal in any way. I'm just ripping the paper from beneath it that hasn't completely die cut through. So full disclosure, if you make sure that your flowers are die cut completely through, it's going to be just a little bit easier. But by having those pieces in place, it takes all of the guesswork out of which petal goes where, and it also makes it really easy when you're doing that ink blending at the beginning stage to know exactly where the shadow would be or where you want the shadow to be, to know where the center of the petal would be. It just is so much easier if you leave all of those pieces in there rather than it taking them all out to do the ink blending. Now, I typically do this technique this way where I use some liquid glue to glue everything down. One way to make it a little bit easier if you wanted is to add a little bit of a sheet adhesive to your die cuts before die cutting. Like there's Sizzix adhesive sheets. I can't remember the other, I can see the packaging, but there's another one that is out, just an adhesive sheet, putting that on the back of your cardstock before you're die cutting. And then it would essentially make these die cuts into little stickers, take a little bit of a step away because you wouldn't have to add that liquid glue. But to be honest, I don't find that liquid glue takes much extra time, so I don't mind doing it in it at all. For my card itself, I'm going to be using the background that I did right at the beginning, where I used that poppy background plate with absolutely no ink. So I have that cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and then I cut a piece of Hammermill cardstock to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. In order to make sure that that cardstock blended perfectly with my floral die cuts, I used that summer garden pad just to ink around the edges. That way I've got perfect ink coordination with that. And once that is drying with that acrylic block on there, I can place my poppy die cuts and make sure to figure out my placement before assembling my card. Now, when I saw this card in my head, I saw a vertical card, but I didn't like the way the pods and the bud were lying on top of the other petal, or on top of the other poppy. So I decided to change it to a horizontal card. I love this orientation a lot more. Now, what I should have done if I wanted to make this a vertical card is cut off the bud and the poppy pod, but I would have done that before assembling everything because of that vellum shadow behind it. So it's totally possible to do that. And then I could have inserted those pieces elsewhere to have them not mirroring each other. So just a note to do that if you wanted to have a vertical card, to do that ahead of time before assembling everything. For my 4th card, I'm going to use some Sukwang tape on top of some Hammermill cardstock and trim it off. I like using this in a big roll. If you like using Sukwang tape, it's a lot more economical to use it with a whole roll, but you can buy it in the sheets if you're new to that and you don't know if you're going to really love it. Off screen, I die cut it. Now, when I die cut it, we're going through the tape backing as well as the adhesive as well as the cardstock. So it's going to have a little bit of a harder time going through everything. But for the technique that I'm doing, it only needs to die cut through the outside part of it. So we don't need to die cut through all of the petal pieces. If by chance it does die cut through those petal pieces, you can put some tape on the back to hold them in. We're using some tweezers here. Now, these aren't reverse tweezers. I often use reverse tweezers in my videos. These are tweezers that you have to squeeze shut in order to hold them shut. And this is just to pick up that backing of the Sukwang and pull it off of the individual areas. I'm using 2 different colors of Perfect Pearls for my petals, and then I'm using a 3rd color for the greenery and for the outline. So for the petals, I'm using grape soda, I think it's called. I just wrote down grape. And then the pink is pink bubblegum. I'm putting the purple color in the center or towards the base of the petal, and then I'm using the pink on the outside part. I'm using more Perfect Pearls than I typically would when I'm creating because I wanted it to go a little bit faster for the video. You can be a little lighter with it. You don't need to use quite as much, so I wouldn't have quite this much waste. I also like to have a Swiffer dusting cloth right next to me so that anytime I have too much excess around, I can easily clean that up, and a Swiffer cloth does that absolutely perfectly. The brush that I'm using is just a Perfect Pearls brush. It's a soft brush. It picks up the Perfect Pearls really, really well. If you happen to get too much out of your container, you can tap that brush on this side of the container and some of it will fall off. So then you can control exactly how much is on your brush. For this poppy, I'm doing the petals first as well as the poppy pod and the bud. And then I'm going to take the outside part of the backing off and I'm going to do the lines as well as the greenery. And I'm going to do that in pewter Perfect Pearls. You could also do green if you wanted it to be green, but for my background, I want them to be silver. And this pewter is going to blend in absolutely beautifully with that. I'm using the exact same brush, and you can see that because I'm not blending 2 colors here, I'm just picking up some of the excess from my table and making sure to put it on the exposed adhesive. Now, we have adhesive here, so it's going to stick perfectly on here. You don't need to do anything after this. If you wanted and you didn't want to use the double-sided tape, you could die cut these pieces, use the press and seal like I did with my last card, and instead of using a brush on the adhesive, you could paint these areas in. Because Perfect Pearls has a binding agent in it, you could use it as a shimmery watercolor paint and paint those areas. I like the look of it with the double-sided tape. You could also do it with the double-sided tape and glitter. So there's many different ways to go with this. It just creates a little bit of a different look to it. For my background, I'm using the Mirrored Arch Blooms press plate, and I have a sentiment in here. When I had this vision or the idea of this card in my head, my spatial awareness was not working properly. So I end up covering the sentiment because what I originally had planned is not going to work. There's not enough space for it. But what I do for this background is I use Versamark ink, and I'm going to heat emboss it with some silver embossing powder. I use an embossing powder tool on top of my cardstock before adding or before pressing that Versamark ink in there, just to make sure that that ink or that powder is only going to stick to where I have that ink pressed. Then I'm using an embossing tool to melt that powder right where it is. If by chance you have any powder where you don't want it to go, you definitely want to use a small brush to dust it off or brush it off before you start heat embossing. Once you've done your heat embossing, it's too far or too late to take anything off. It'll be melted into the paper. You won't be able to take anything off. You want to make sure that that embossing powder goes from dull and granular to glossy and smooth. And it's kind of a magical process. If you've never done heat embossing before, it's got a nice wow factor, especially when you first start out. I absolutely love it. It's a classic technique that I use often. So this is what I originally intended for my poppy to go in the lower left-hand corner. But the poppy is a little bit too big, and you covering a little bit of that sentiment. So it wasn't going to work. So I changed up my design just a little bit. I noticed when I was going to trim this down that there was a couple areas of my embossing powder that wasn't totally heated. I'm trimming down my background here just a little bit on each side, making sure not to cut off any of the embossing, but just enough to give a little bit of an edge. So probably maybe 1/8 of an inch down in total on the width and the height. Then I'm going to use some matte silver cardstock from the Treasured Silver Cardstock Pack from Spellbinders. This cardstock pack has 15 sheets in the package. There are 3 sheets each of 5 different finishes, and I love the fact that they coordinate with each other so beautifully. In order to make that specialty cardstock go a little bit further, I'm using this piece here as a mat around my better pressed silver embossed background, but I also want to use it as a mat around my centerpiece. So I'm taking that Mirrored Arch Labels die and I am cutting it in the center of my mat. When I go and glue down this heat emboss piece, it's going to cover that hole. You're never going to know it's there, but I'm getting double duty out of my cardstock rather than having to use a separate piece of that cardstock for this area. The center part of that middle part there is just some Hammermill cardstock. Any white cardstock will work. I just happen to have that sitting right there. And I'm going to use that to cover up my sentiment. And then I'm going to put my poppy in the center of that area of the card. Now I left my background, my floral background embossed piece there, just silver and the cardstock because I wanted the focus to be on the poppy. If you wanted to add a little bit more color, like I said before, you can use Perfect Pearls as a shimmery watercolor paint if you wanted to tie that in. I wanted to make sure not to take any focus away from that poppy in the center, so I left it as is. I also left it without a sentiment on it. You could easily add a sentiment to that if you wanted to. Again, I was keeping the focus on that poppy. So here we have 4 different cards using the Yanas Poppies Collection. I absolutely love this collection. Poppies are a symbol of Remembrance Day here in Canada, so I plan on using these cards to create a few Remembrance Day cards in the future. I think they're going to be absolutely gorgeous for that. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.